Hi guys, I am really excited to share this book with you. It's called Founding Mothers, Women of America in the Revolutionary Era, and it's by Linda Grant Pauw. I'm not sure how to say her name. Anyway, I always thought that I wanted to live in the American Revolutionary time, and after studying it some more, I have decided that no, I don't think I would. It was a ridiculously hard time to live. My husband teases me all the time about what a germaphobe I am, and I think I would have had a really hard time. Living now and going back then, it would have been ridiculous. Obviously, if you live in the time, you don't know what you're missing. It is what it is. But living today and studying this time frame, whew, it was really rough. But I wanted to share this book with you because it has so many cool stories about what women did during the Revolutionary time and when America was first established. So I have quite a few things I'd like to share with you from this book. The first being on page 3. Women's work included 5 main areas of responsibility: feeding the family, manufacturing the family's clothing, and such household essentials as candles and soap, keeping the home, the family, and the family's clothing clean, serving as doctor, nurse, and midwife for all members of the household, including servants and slaves, and caring for children, both the mother's own and apprentices or children of relatives who lived with the family. All of these tasks were done by the mistress of the household herself or delegated to a child, slave, or servant under the mistress's careful supervision. Whew, that is a long list of things that they needed to do, because during this time frame, whatever you needed, you had to grow it, make it, build it, find it, trade for it. You couldn't just run to the grocery store and grab something you needed at the last minute. It was a very difficult time frame to live. On page 8, I thought this was kind of cool. It talks about a gazillion different ways to make corn, and it's just kind of a cool thing. There were hundreds of ways to prepare it. It might be steamed, roasted, broiled, or popped. Most of it, however, was ground into meal at a local watermill or by hand with mortar and pestle devices. Ground meal might be mixed with water and boiled into a mush for hasty pudding. Mixed with butter, sugar, eggs, mace, and nutmeg, with a bit of wine or rum stirred in, made an elegant dessert pudding. Or the mush could be fried on a griddle to make johnny cake or corn pone. Men going off to the field or children going to school would put a few of these hot cakes in their pockets or hats to keep themselves warm. Later in the day, they would be eaten for lunch. The famous Boston brown bread was also made of cornmeal. Connor and Kelly and I just did a video of making hoe cakes, or basically cornmeal pancakes, which was a favorite of George Washington for his birthday. So I will share that video in the description of this. But corn was one of those things that they cooked it a gazillion different ways because it grew easily. Okay, this is on page 12 to 13. And it talks about how clothing and material was dyed. Dyeing was a skill highly valued by colonial women. They passed on their coloring recipes as family treasures. During the winter, when there was less work to do, still a lot of work. Women worked out new formulas that produced different shades with good resistance to fading. They discovered, for instance, that onion skins boiled in a brass kettle would produce lemon yellow thread, while onion skins boiled in an iron kettle produced a gold yellow. So the way that you cook it changes the coloring. For a greenish yellow shade, St. John's wort and alum were boiled together. Skeins of dyed thread were kept in bags tied with sample rags showing the color inside, and the recipe was frequently attached. Such thread was then available for elaborate embroidery projects as well as for winding on the loom. Wool cloth was slightly easier to produce than linen, but still difficult. After the sheep were sheared, the fleece was picked through and brambles and other dirt removed. Then the wool was washed and dried, and pork fat was rubbed into it. Next, the wool was combed with a wool card, which pulled the fibers into parallel rows that could be lifted out, spun into thread, and dyed as the flax was. A cloth made of a combination of linen and wool, called linsey woolsey, was very popular in colonial America. While some women, by the late 18th century, might turn their skeins of thread over to a professional weaver, many still made their own cloth at home. So they had to do from start to end, and then they made the clothes. We were so babied, you guys. If the household was very large, a special weaving house might be built to accommodate the loom. The warp of the fabric was laid on the loom by hand, each thread placed precisely and held at a constant tension. The weaving itself consisted of pressing a foot treadle to separate the warp threads, throwing a threaded shuttle between them tight. Since this work was done in spare moments between other chores, it might easily take a year for a wife to make her husband a cloth suit. Such a garment was highly valued by its owner. It would be worn only on special occasions, mended when it became worn, remade for his son, and finally turned into patchwork. Not all clothing was woven. Stockings, mittens, and caps were knitted. Knitting was a constant feminine occupation. Little girls began to make stockings and mittens as soon as they could hold the needles, and elderly grandmothers, who were too feeble and blind to do any other work, still kept their hands occupied with their needles. Wealthy women as well as poor automatically reached for their knitting whenever they sat down. Never an idle hand. They were always working and doing something. There was always work to do. It reminds me of Little House on the Prairie, the long winter. Everybody had a job. Someone had to chop the firewood. Someone had to get the meat. Someone had to clean there's a job for everybody. They were always working. This is on page 20. This was a little bit rough to read. Parenting back then. How to describe that? It was not what it is today, for sure. They were very rough with their children. So this is page 20 to 21. The high death rate among children in colonial America was due partly to uncontrolled epidemics of such diseases as measles and diphtheria, but much of it was due to the child care practices of colonial mothers. Indeed, it is in their relationship with their children, which seems to us unfeeling and frequently cruel, that colonial women appear most alien to our time. This is what I kind of feel like. Adults of the 18th century thought of children as animals or servants, not as human beings. Furthermore, they did not believe children would develop into human beings unless they were forced to it. It was their nature to be sinful and animalistic. Consequently, which is actually the opposite that is true of children. Consequently, permitting a child to follow its natural inclinations in any way was considered the sign of a bad parent. Rather than trying to encourage independence and personal development in their offspring, colonial parents worked to break the child's spirit. For instance, it was noted that infants preferred crawling on all fours to walking upright. In order to discourage such animal behavior, a crawling infant was put in a cart, a sort of cage that came up to its armpits and forced it to stand. An alternative was to tie the child with leading strings fastened to the shoulders that would hold it upright. As a popular book explained on child rearing, parents should carefully subdue the wills of their children and accustom them to obedience and submission. We've come a long ways, right? I can't even count how many parenting books I've read, but reading this and learning from our history is important. Part of why I think parents were so rough on their children is because life was just really hard. And I know on days when I am just exhausted and pooped, my patience tends to be a little bit thinner. So I can't imagine being as tired as they were and having worked, just being physically drained literally every day, what the level of patience was needed with children. But reading this also makes me want to think, I don't want to do that. I really want to love my children and be more patient with them and see the things that I can help them grow and develop in instead of, pushing them down. So learn from the past what not to do. This is on page 25. A woman whose handling of cows and chickens was superior would soon be earning butter and egg money. Colonial Americans believed in the virtues of thrift, frugality, and hard work. Those are definitely three of my very favorite things. Consequently, when they earned a bit of money, they did not spend all of it to improve their standard of living. Instead, a good part of such income would be reinvested. A woman might use her butter and egg money, for instance, to buy another cow. But there were other choices. Since both men and women began their adult life with a variety of skills, accumulated savings could be used for other purposes. The superior dairy woman, for instance, might use her funds to buy a large loom and become a professional weaver, taking in spun yarn produced by her neighbors and turning it into cloth for a fee. In this way, a household industry was born. Like I said, everything they got was either grown or made or bartered, or they had to figure out how to get it. So if you had a lot of skills to be able to make things, that was a very good quality to have. This is on page 34, talking about the printing press. I thought this was pretty cool. Because of the social and political importance of the press, women in the printing business have attracted more attention than those in any other occupation. The first press to be brought to America was owned by a woman. I didn't know that. She and her husband brought it over from England, but he died on the way. At the time of the Revolution, about a dozen women were owners of printing establishments. Other women, wives and daughters of owners, set type, helped in the shop, or ran the bookshops or stationery stores that printers usually maintained as a sideline. Deborah Reed Franklin ran the print shop of her husband, Benjamin Franklin, when he was out of the country. There were a number of women printers in the Franklin family. His sister-in-law, Anne Smith Franklin, had been named State Printer of Rhode Island in 1736 and became publisher of the Newport Mercury in 1762. Margaret H. Bach, the wife of Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bach, published the Aurora in Philadelphia after her husband's death in 1798. The Goddards were another prominent printing family. Sarah Updike Goddard of Providence, Rhode Island, lent her son William enough money to start the Providence Gazette in 1765, and then became his partner. A few years later, William Goddard and his sister Mary Catherine Goddard went to Baltimore. They bought out the printing business that Nicholas Hasselbaugh had bequeathed to his widow and that she had been carrying on alone. The two Goddards began to publish the Maryland Journal and Baltimore Advertiser in 1773. Since her brother and had other interests, Mary Catherine Goddard did most of the work. She was chosen by Congress to print the official copy of the Declaration of Independence. How cool is that? In 1776. Later, she became postmistress of Baltimore and operated a bookstore and a paper mill in addition to her publishing activities. She was one of the few unmarried colonial women to achieve economic independence. As I read all of the family numbers with the last name of Goddard, I'm wondering if the Goddard School of Learning is relatives to these print masters. They have education and learning in their genes, if that's the case. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Okay, on page 36, this is talking about taverns. And I thought this was really interesting because bars and taverns were a meeting place where a lot of planning happened back in the day. And they were very important during the Revolutionary War. Okay, occasionally women built wharves which would attract ships to a shop or other related business. Sometimes they sold products they made themselves. Such was the case with a woman of Wilmington, North Carolina, who was described by a visitor in 1775. The missus of this place is a pattern of industry. She has, it seems, a garden from which she supplies the town with what vegetables they use, also with melons and other fruits. She even descends to make minced pies, tarts, and cheesecakes, and little biscuits. It's spelled very strangely, which she sends down to town once or twice a day. Besides her eggs, poultry, and butter, and she's the only one who continues to have milk. This woman had found an ingenious way to avoid problems with creditors. All her little commodities are contrived so as to not exceed 1 penny apiece. And her customers know she will not run tick. That's a tally, of what you owe. Which, were they to run by the length of 6 pence, must be the case, as that is a sum not in everybody's power. And she must be paid by some other articles, whereas the 2 coppers, that is halfpence, are ready money. Other women featured luxury items imported from abroad. Madame Le Mercier, whose shop was on Back Street in Boston, advertised during the Revolution that she stocked every sort of beauties just received from France. When the war was over and importing from England could resume, Margaret Phillips of Boston announced her large and beautiful assortment of picked goods from London. Women importers appeared in all the major port towns. The operation of a tavern involved little more than homemaking on a larger scale. Most taverns were run by husband and wife, but perhaps as many as a third were run by women alone. A widow who inherited her home and perhaps some house slaves, but little land, or who felt unable to make a living by farming, would find taking in lodgers and entertaining travelers an obvious means of support. With a few improvements, putting in a billiard table, setting up a bar, and stocking the cellar with plenty of rum, wine, and beer, a woman was ready to apply for a license and hang out a sign. Women who ran taverns near a body of water might assure the popularity of their establishments if they could arrange to be appointed manager of a public ferry. Colonial taverns served a number of functions in the community. In addition to providing lodging for strangers, they were meeting places for local businessmen and centers of social life. Men held their political meetings in taverns. Cockfights and lottery drawings were held there too. The stagecoaches that brought travelers also brought news from the outside world and copies of the newspapers from other towns in America. The tavern was therefore the center of information in a community. I thought that was pretty cool. I didn't realize that a third of taverns were personally owned just by women. That would have been a tough job back then. I don't know about that, but it is really cool. It's neat to think of the industry and the really just the stamina that women had to be able to do these jobs. Okay, this is cool. So when I read this, I was like, that is very different from today. It's about doctors. So remember when doctors used to make house calls and actually physically go to your houses? Well, even prior to that, when men were mostly doctors, it was actually women. They used to heal all the people in their family, tons of people in the community, and they would trade, medicines and secrets and things that worked. And so this is rather interesting. On page 41, it was considered quite proper for doctors to advertise their cures in the newspapers. In October of 1766, the Virginia Gazette printed testimonials from patients of Constant Woodson, who, it was said, had cured them of cancer. About the same time, Mary Adams of South Carolina was advertising her cure for the blind and all disorders in the eyes. A certain Mrs. Kaiser of Maryland declared that her remedy for ague would effect a cure in 3 days, and her charge for the cure is only 5 shillings. Mrs. Hughes of Virginia, whose specialty was ringworms, scald heads, sore eyes, the piles, worms in children, and several other disorders, promised her patients no cure, no pay. Although practicing medicine was rarely a full-time occupation, midwifery was. 18th century America had a fast-growing population. Obituaries of midwives often identified them as having delivered thousands of children in the course of their careers. In 1771, a Williamsburg, Virginia paper recorded the passing of Mrs. Catherine Blakely of this city in the 76th year of her age, an eminent midwife, and who in the course of her practice brought upwards of 3,000 children into this world. That's a lot of babies. Her record was surpassed by a South Carolina practitioner. Tuesday last died greatly lamented, aged 73 years, Mrs. Elizabeth Hunt, a native of this province and practicing midwife. It is said to appear by an account regularly kept by her that she had been present at the birth of nearly 4,000 children. Midwifery was traditionally a woman's profession. Although most midwives had no formal training, a surprising number of those who advertised in the last half of the 18th century had attended European medical schools. Thus, a Mrs. Grant, who established a practice in Charleston, South Carolina, announced that she had studied in Edinburgh and could produce letters from the gentlemen whose lectures she attended, and likewise from the professors of anatomy and practice of physic in the city. The few men who began to advertise themselves as man midwives did not present serious competition to women during the 18th century. As a correspondent of the Virginia Gazette observed, a long, unimpassioned practice, early commenced and calmly pursued, is absolutely requisite to give men by art what women attain by nature. I thought that was really interesting. Midwifery is another occupation that, wow, so many women died in childbirth back in the day, and that would have been a really high pressure job to have. And it's one of those things that I appreciate reading from afar, but living back then, I have a lot of friends who probably would have passed away in childbirth, and it's sad to think about that. So it was rough. It was really hard to live back then. Okay, this is on page 44. I am actually curious what you think about this quote. This is one that I appreciated reading, and it gave me pause to think. So let me know in the comments what you think about this one. This is on page 44. It says, the confidence that colonial women could have in their ability to support themselves without a husband produced a generation of women with a degree of self-respect that later generations would view as brazen, unfeminine, and unladylike. I have absolutely nothing but empathy, and I look up to all of these women who lived during this time frame because it would have been really hard to live back then. So calling them brazen, unfeminine, and unladylike is the complete opposite of what I think to be true. I hold them only in the highest regards for their stamina, for their work ethic, for their courage, for their patience, for literally everything. I am just so proud of the heritage I come from and the women whose genes I have in me, because I know that they were super hard workers. But what do you think? Were they brazen, unfeminine, unladylike? What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious. Okay, the next one is on page 80. This book, I have to give a disclaimer, was written in 1975. So some of the verbiage is not very kind, but I'm reading it directly as what the book says. So this starts talking about slavery in America. This, however, is a very good thought. History shows that human beings have a remarkable ability to make the best of things. No matter how hard life is, there are blessings and things you can look for. So the Black population of colonial America worked to make their lives as good as possible under the circumstances. Despite the hardships and the exploitation they endured, they generally succeeded in seizing some pleasure and satisfaction from their lives. They did not become animals even when they were treated as such. They preserved their humanity. Slave mothers and fathers managed to make homes for their children in their humble cabins. I've shared this in another video about, I think it was in 1776, and just it was Lincoln's book. Slavery in general is just a terrible, terrible thing in the history of our country, but we need to learn from it. We need to learn from the hard things, and reading this book made me appreciate that a lot more. Okay, this is about cooking and how cooking was shared throughout different communities. So cooking held the place in the interest of Black women that the fabric arts held for white women. In a life filled with hard work, they would exert themselves a little more to make the food they prepared something special. On weekends, when a friend or relative came to visit from a neighboring plantation, or when her husband caught or stole some special treat, a slave woman would bring all her skill to bear in preparing a memorable meal. The use of herbs and spices made Black cooking distinctive. Red pepper, Malagueta pepper, and sesame seeds and oil came from Africa. Gumbos and jambalayas are examples of the subtly flavored dishes entirely alien to European culinary traditions that slaves introduced in America. European cooking back then was pretty bland. Americans ate potatoes, bread. They had salt to flavor things, but it was pretty boring. So Blacks introduced a lot more flavor. Jambalaya and all these really delicious foods came during the slave time. And then cooking became more of a melting pot. Everybody shared different recipes and foods. Okay, this is on page 101. This also talks about the melting pot and how America has become a mix of lots and lots of different cultures. So by the time of the American Revolution, the cultures of all these peoples had undergone great changes. The arrival of vast numbers of Europeans and Africans had introduced new elements into the American environment. Some of these were deadly, foreign diseases, for example. Others were welcomed by the Indians as improvements in their lives. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Native Americans had been in the Stone Age. That is, they had no metal tools of any kind and made do with implements of stone and bone. These conditions required both men and women in Indian cultures to perfect a wider variety of skills and work harder just to stay alive than was necessary for Europeans. Hard as colonial Americans worked on the early frontier, the Native Americans had to work even harder. if you don't have the proper tool, it is very hard to do certain jobs. So that was something that was helpful, introducing metal and being able to have proper tools for different jobs. When they had the opportunity to acquire European goods, the Indians rapidly adapted them to their way of life. By the time of the American Revolution, they were no longer Stone Age people, and their lifestyles were considerably different from what they had been a century and a half earlier. By the middle of the 18th century, the way of life of the Eastern Indians was wholly dependent on their European neighbors. When they could trade furs for the superior knives, kettles, and needles of the Europeans, there was no reason to continue to practice the arts of pottery making and fashioning tools out of stone and bones. Yet when these arts had been neglected for a generation, when the oldest Indian to understand them died without passing them on to a younger worker, they could never be recovered. They didn't pass it on. Although the Native Americans increasingly resented the movement of large numbers of foreigners into their lands, their relationship with the colonists was ambivalent. They did not want them moving farther inland, but they could not do without them. The roles of men and women in the Indian societies had been established under Stone Age conditions. The introduction of European technology made life easier for both sexes, but the general division of labor remained the same. Even the European way of life, after all, required mastery of a substantial number of specialized skills. It was not possible in any pre-industrial society to delay training a child for the work it would do later in life for very long after its birth. The tasks to be learned were too many and too complex. Consequently, since it was observed that adult males generally were physically stronger than women, and since it was impossible to delay training a child while it grew to an age where those individual boys and girls who reversed the usual pattern could be identified, all boys were automatically trained to men's work, and all girls were trained to do women's work. These roles were not, however, rigidly fixed. Women whose aptitude was clearly directed toward the male role occasionally appear as warriors and even war chiefs without being considered unnatural or losing their status as wives and mothers. In the primitive Indian societies, men's work was hunting and war. The work required muscular exertion, skill in the use of weapons, ability to endure physical hardship, and courage, even foolhardy courage, in the face of danger. Stalking a quick-footed animal until it was in range of a bow and arrow was an art not easily mastered. Much of the Indian hunting was done with traps or by driving the animals into an ambush. Even here, however, there could be danger in a confrontation with a wounded animal. To do this job of providing meat for the tribe, an Indian man had to work constantly to keep himself in top physical condition. That's a lot different than running to the convenience store to get a package of donuts. The Indians did not hunt every day of the year. In order to preserve their skills and keep themselves in shape, Indian men spent the non-hunting seasons in quasi-ceremonial raids on Indian enemies or in what the white population sneered at as games. These games included contests in archery and hatchet throwing, running, and swimming. Only one team sport has been identified, a form of football, played on a smooth beach with the goalposts placed a mile apart. That's a huge field. Granted that the Indian men may have enjoyed these workouts, which continued for days at a time, they were certainly not idling away their time. Had the men neglected such exercises and chosen instead to sit before their wigwams, cooking or sewing as the women did, there would have been precious few deer caught in the next hunting season. Since hunting, or keeping in shape for hunting, absorbed all of the Indian men's time, all the other work of the tribe was done by the women. She raised all the food crops, cooked, sewed, built the wigwams, and even dragged home the carcasses after a successful hunt. Oh, just reading that almost makes me tired. Hunting and eating and surviving back then would have been so hard. Oh my gosh, physically taxing and emotionally, such a crazy time to live back then. Okay, in addition to that, it explains the roles of women in the Indian communities. So this is what a European said of the women. Their women were their mules, exclaimed an early French explorer. The status of Indian women was not, however, as depressed as it appeared to the casual observer. Indian men held women's work in high regard. They were well aware that the skills of the women and their ability to carry heavy loads were indispensable to Indian living and normally impossible for men to duplicate. It took the European men some time to realize that the Indians were right when they declared that it was absolutely necessary for them to take women along on expeditions into the interior. Male guides would not be adequate. As one Indian man exclaimed, women were made for labor, quite literally. One of them can carry or haul as much as two men can do. They pitch our tents, make and mend our clothing, keep us warm at night, and in fact, there is no such thing as traveling any considerable distance or for any length of time in this country without their assistance. After a few disastrous experiences, the Europeans learned to include wives as well as husbands when they hired Indian guides. One of the main Indian women who is so famous is Sacagawea, and that's because she was with Lewis and Clark, and they clearly were very well known in history. So this on page 106 talks about Sacagawea. The only Indian guide woman who has attracted any attention is Sacagawea, who accompanied the Lewis and Clark expedition. Contrary to popular legend, Sacagawea did not show Lewis and Clark the way to the Pacific. Although she was a valuable member of the expedition, her functions were the traditional ones. She was an interpreter, she gathered food and cooked, and on one occasion she saved some valuable records and scientific apparatus from being washed overboard. Captain Clark obviously admired her, and after her death in 1812, at the age of 25, he adopted and raised her two children. Sacagawea was a member of the Shoshone tribe, which inhabited what is now central Idaho. Her proficiency in trail skills was well developed because her people were nomadic and spent most of their time traveling. Eastern women, however, traveled much less. Their skills were primarily agricultural. The importance of this activity was so great that women's work was respected even more among Eastern Indians than it was among those who found most of their food supply by simple hunting and foraging. Meriwether Lewis pointed out that the importance of the female in savage life has no necessary relation to the virtues of the men, but is regulated wholly by their capacity to be useful. Where the women can aid in procuring subsistence for the tribe, they are treated with more equality, and their importance is proportioned to the share which they take in that labor, while in countries where subsistence is chiefly procured by the exertions of the men, the women are considered and treated as burdens. Among Eastern Indians, the labor of the women provided most of the tribal diet. There was a portion of this that talked about when the Indian women would pack the food for hunting trips. If they didn't want the particular hunting trip or activity to happen and they didn't pack the food, it didn't happen. They could basically veto an expedition or a hunting trip just because they didn't pack the food, because it was so important the way they packed the food. This was interesting. So remember how I said parenting was totally crazy during this time frame? It was common for children to be taken and then be in Indian villages, and the children were actually happier raised in the Indian villages. So this is on page 122. There seems to be no question that children were happier raised by the Indians. Observers all agreed that the Indians were very fond of their children, and they showed equal affection to those they adopted. The Indians thought the European customs of beating their children, training them in stern Calvinistic morality, requiring them to wear clothing, and discouraging play and demonstrations of affection were cruel and unnatural. The little children seemed to agree and regularly chose their Indian mothers over their natural mothers when given a choice. Many could only be brought back to white society tied hand and foot, and then must be watched constantly or they would run away to their Indian families. What do you think about that? When I read that, I thought, well, that's one take, I guess. But just based on how they were treated in the American culture, I could see deciding that instead of going back home. Okay, this is an interesting story about Sybil Ludington. She was a 16-year-old daughter of Colonel Henry Ludington, who commanded a Patriot militia unit. On the evening of April 26, 1777, an exhausted messenger arrived at the Ludington home announcing that the British were raiding Danbury, just across the state line in Connecticut. Danbury was a Patriot supply center guarded by fewer than 200 Continental troops. They were under attack by 2,000 British and Loyalist troops. Colonel Ludington's men were urgently needed. During the Revolution, the local militia units operated as a volunteer fire brigade might today. They did not live in barracks, but in their own homes, scattered over a wide area. Someone must ride through the night and carry the word to the militiamen that they must turn out. Sybil Ludington did the job. Mounted on her horse, Star, and carrying a stick in her hand, she rode 40 miles through the dark countryside, banging on the doors of the houses as she passed. Those who answered Paul Revere's call had not saved Concord, and the men who turned out that night were not in time to save Danbury. Sybil Ludington, however, did successfully complete her mission, while Paul Revere was captured during his midnight ride. Her father's troops were able eventually to force the British to retreat back to their ships in Long Island Sound. The stories of women who participated in the military activities of the war are mentioned in Chapter 8. Women's civilian support activities were just as important, however, if less dramatic. The American Revolution is the only war the United States has ever fought in which there was not a pool of unemployed or underemployed women to take up the slack when men were recruited into the army. To keep the army supplied and keep the civilian population from starving, women and children had to work longer hours and cut down their own consumption of food and clothing. The Revolutionary War was only won because there were people helping from all sides. It was totally crazy how unsupplied they were, like lack of food, lack of training, lack of weapons, lack of clothing. It was crazy. There was help on all the fronts, and women definitely were behind the scenes helping with that. Now, that clothing for soldiers was needed. Women's spinning became more essential than ever. Remember, they didn't have a lot of uniforms, so women did a lot of work. The Pennsylvania Magazine noted in December of 1775, while the men defend our borders and cultivate our land, the women must not neglect what is proper in their sphere. As we must furnish clothing for many thousands, more than we have heretofore done, the spinning wheel requires this particular attention. There are at least 600,000 females in these 13 colonies of an age sufficient to spin. A well-to-do woman who had not earlier participated in the tea boycott or worked herself to produce clothing at home became active in these ways after the fighting began. In a letter to a British officer, she wrote, "I will tell you what I have done. My only brother I have sent to the camp with my prayers, and had I 20 sons and brothers, they should go. I have retrenched every superfluous expense in my table and family. Tea I have not drunk since last Christmas, nor bought a new cap or gown since your defeat at Lexington, and what I never did before, have learned to knit, and am now making stockings of American wool for my servants. I know this, that as free I can die but once. These are the sentiments of all my sister Americans." Women were tough back then. They really wanted to help win the war too. Okay, this is talking about women's groups and when they were formed during the Revolutionary time. Finally, women's groups might use their influence to encourage men to enlist in the army. The young ladies of the best families of Mecklenburg County in North Carolina publicly declared that they would not keep company with any young gentleman who had not done military service. The young ladies of Roane County quickly followed this example. Their resolutions were entered in the minutes of the Patriot Committee of Safety and declared worthy the imitation of every young lady in America. In New Jersey, it was reported that the fair ones in our neighborhood have already entered into resolve for every mother to disown her son and refuse the caress of her husband, and every maiden to reject the addresses of her gallant if these men wavered in their devotion to the cause. Whew, that's one way of putting it. The largest of the women's wartime organizations was known simply as the Association. It was founded in Philadelphia in May of 1780, under the leadership of Esther Reed, wife of Pennsylvania Governor Joseph Reed. The association was conceived as a national organization, coordinated by governors' wives and Martha Washington. Its purpose was to raise money to be distributed as a special gift of gratitude to the Continental troops and offering of the ladies. There is evidence of association activity in Maryland, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia, and South Carolina, as well as in Pennsylvania. Although it is impossible to estimate how many women may have worked with the association, it was unquestionably the largest organization of American women up to that time and for at least half a century afterward. When women work as a group, we can do a lot of good. Okay, this is Daughters of Liberty, kind of talking about the same thing, and George Washington sending them a thank you. The support of the Daughters of Liberty must have been deeply appreciated by the ragged men in the American camps, at a time when neither Congress nor the state governments had been able to provide the troops with adequate clothing, the organized efforts of American women stepped into the gap. General Washington sent the leaders of the association a formal letter of thanks. It reads, "The army ought not to regret their sacrifices or sufferings when they meet with so flattering a reward as the sympathy of your sex, nor can they fear that their interests will be neglected while espoused by advocates as powerful as they are amiable." I really love that he wasn't the president yet, but General George Washington shared that thank you and showed appreciation for what the women were doing. This, on page 201, start talking about voting rights. It says, although voting rights became an important goal for the 19th century feminist movement, the issue was unimportant for women of the Revolutionary generation. So long as most women married and the common law put wives under the absolute dominion of their husbands, reform of the common law was a far more vital goal than suffrage. The equality of women under the law, which was deliberately repudiated in the English legal tradition, was rarely suggested as a desirable goal. Some of this was really hard to read. The fact that women were completely subservient to their husbands, and by the court of law, women did not have a lot of rights, and it was a long time before we did. But to say that even fixing this prior to getting women's ability to vote means that it was really hard. It was a very difficult time to live. And this is one of those things that I'm grateful to read from a distance. I wouldn't have wanted to live it, but it makes me grateful for what I have and the rights that I have and how I can teach my daughter and other girls. We are very blessed today because of what women prior to us worked for us. On page 210, let's see. This is talking about how women taught their children. It was generally necessary for women to educate their own children, and they could not educate sons properly unless they were educated themselves. Others who argued for improved education for women followed the same argument. For instance, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, "If you complain of education in sons, what shall I say of daughters who every day experience the want of it? With regard to the education of my own children, I feel myself soon out of my depth, destitute in every part of education. If we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women. If as much depends as it is allowed upon the early education of youth, and the first principles which are instilled take the deepest root, great benefit must arise from the literary accomplishments in women." I am a big advocate of studying and learning and developing your knowledge as a mother so that you can teach your children. We homeschool, and homeschooling means the whole family is learning. If there's something I want to learn, I'm going to learn it, and then I'm going to teach it to my kids, and we all go down little rabbit holes and learn together. But I can only teach as much as I know. So moms always need to be learning and growing. Okay, this was actually really interesting. It's about Mary Wollstonecraft's book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Her book became available in Boston and Philadelphia bookshops in 1790 and was received very favorably. Although the book aroused fierce criticism in later years, it expressed opinions that were fairly common in America immediately after the Revolution. As Elizabeth Drinker, an upper-class Philadelphian, put it in many of her sentiments, the Wollstonecraft, as some of our friends say, speaks my mind. Like the American writers on women's education, Mary Wollstonecraft emphasized that serious education, rather than training as a lady of fashion, would make a woman a better wife and mother. Women subjected by ignorance to their sensations, she wrote, and only taught to look for happiness and love, refine on sensual feelings, and adopt metaphysical notions, respecting their passion, which leads them shamefully to the neglects of duties of life. Her encouragement to women to consider themselves intellectually equal to men and to devote themselves to serious study made her work popular in American girls' schools. A pupil at one Philadelphia school prepared an address in praise of Mrs. Wollstonecraft for a presentation at a public program. Another admirer of the English writer produced 10 stanzas of verse for the Philadelphia Minerva, concluding, so this is a poem they wrote, "Let snarling critics frown, their maxims I disown, their ways detest, by man your tyrant lord, females no more be odd. Let freedom's sacred word inspire your breast. Women, aloud rejoice. Exalt thy feeble voice in cheerful strain. See Wollstonecraft a friend, your injured rights defend. Wisdom her step attend, the cause maintain. Many people backed her book and really wanted to work on women's rights. During the last half of the 18th century, and especially after the Revolution, there was a steady growth in the educational opportunities open to upper class girls. Neither girls nor boys had many opportunities for advanced education in earlier years. Reading, writing, and simple arithmetic were considered sufficient, except for the very wealthy who could afford to teach their children subjects that were ornamental rather than useful. Such young ladies and gentlemen might learn spelling, geography, foreign languages, music, drawing, and dancing, but such education was a luxury. Education has changed a lot too. We have literally everything at our fingertips, and it is a huge blessing to know what we can learn now versus how hard it was to learn during this time frame. The very last thing I'd like to share with you is on page 219, and this is a thought I'd like you to ponder and see what you think. The strong, hardworking, independent women of the Revolutionary generation were quickly forgotten. In 1840, Charles Francis Adams, the grandson of John and Abigail Adams, could write, "The heroism of females of the Revolution has gone from memory with the generation that witnessed it, and nothing, absolutely nothing remains upon the ear of the young of the present day. We are only now beginning to recover their history." I hope that we, by reading from and learning from the past, can realize just how blessed we are in this day and age. So many people worked so hard for us to be able to have the rights that we have, to be able to learn, simply just to get a book and read. This is something that we really take for granted. When the printing press was created and books were printed so we could read them, it was a lot of work to do that. And now we literally have them anywhere. You can pick it up and learn and read whatever you want to read. So I really hope that by studying topics like this and learning from our past, we are able to see just how blessed we are and to share that with others and to use our lives to do good. Learn from the hardships that our ancestors and these people who came before us from their lives to do better in your life. Make your corner brighter and learn and grow. The only things we get to take with us after we pass from this life are the thoughts in our head, the feelings in our heart, and the stuff stays here. You don't get any of your stuff. So the more you can learn and grow and study and fill your brain with all of these good things, the better. And then you can share it with your children, with those around you. I really hope you enjoyed this book discussion, though. This is one of those that it was really hard to read, but I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful for what I learned. And I hope that this gives you some food for thought to be grateful for what you have and to share what you have learned. So, happy studying.